Before the close of the first month, the decision to continue as an effective factor in the world field had become definite, despite the distaste I felt for this domain. It felt like turning one's back upon a rich mine of jewels after gathering but a handful, and then marching back into the dreary domain of iron and brass. However, I found that it could be done, and then I accepted what I thought would be a future in which the best would always be a memory. I had found what I sought during many years, and could see nothing but anticlimax thereafter, so far as the immediately realized consciousness values were concerned. So the further recognition which closed the first cycle came as a complete surprise, for not only did I not seek it, I did not even know that such a state existed, or, if it existed, that it was within the range of human consciousness. I had now already known a state of consciousness that certainly had the value of liberation. A subsequent search through the mystical literature revealed that it was substantially congruent with the mystical experience as such, and was distinctly more comprehensive than many of the mystical unfoldments. So far as I was familiar with it, the Brahmanical literature always represented the liberated state as the end term of all attainment. In this literature, I had found nothing requiring more depth of insight than I now had glimpsed, although there was a vast mass of psychical detail quite foreign to my experience. So I was quite unprepared to find that there were even deeper levels of transcendence. However, had I understood a few obscure references in Buddhist literature, I would have been warned. In order to reach some understanding of the culminating phase of the recognition, certain contrasting facts concerning the first phase must be given emphasis. As I have already affirmed, there is sufficient evidence of the fact of mystical recognition, together with the reported affective value, to render it an object of possible desire. Long ago I had learned enough to realize that it was desirable, and had set forth in search of it. There also exists a sufficient statement of the reasons why an individual who has attained this recognition should turn his back upon it, as it were, to show that such a course was desirable in its social bearings. But there does not seem to be anything further which could be conceived as an object of desire. Now the culminating effect of the present realization with respect to desire is that the latter has fulfilled its office in the individual sense, and there's nothing more to wish for. I certainly felt in the transcendent state abundant completion, and vastly more than I had anticipated. So, what more could there be? I see now that there was a defect in this completion that kept it from being a full state of equilibrium. It consisted predominantly of the positive end terms of the best in human consciousness. Thus it was a state of superlative joy, peace, rest, freedom, and knowledge. And all of this stands in contrast to the world field as fullness contrasts to emptiness. Hence there did exist a tension in the sense of attractiveness that was incompatible with the perfection of balance. There was a distinction between being bound to embodied consciousness and not being so bound that made a difference to me. I had to resist the inclination toward the latter state in order to continue existence in the former. In other words, there are in this earlier phase of recognition certain tensions that call for a higher resolution. But it was the perspective of the culminating recognition that rendered all of this clear. The first stage did not, of itself, disclose any further possibility of conceivable attainment, and so I was disposed to give it a greater terminal value than it really possessed. So far, I have outlined 3 progressively comprehensive recognitions. Each was realized after a period of conscious effort in the appropriate direction. In each case, I had some reason to believe that there was a goal to be sought. In the first 2 instances, I was aware that there was something more remaining to be realized, because the sense of incompleteness was only partly liquidated. In the third instance, this liquidation seemed to be complete, and then I simply turned my back upon the full individual enjoyment of it for such period of time as might be necessary to fulfill some more comprehensive purpose reaching beyond individual concerns. In contrast, the culminating recognition came with the force of an unexpected bestowal without my having put forth any conscious personal effort toward the attainment of it. Thus, in this case, my personal relationship or attitude was passive in a deep sense. During the day preceding the final recognition, I had been busy writing, and my mind was exceptionally clear and acute. In fact, the intellectual energy was of an unusual degree of intensity. The mood was decidedly one of intellectual assertion and dominance. This feature is interesting for the reason that it is precisely the state of mind that ordinarily would be regarded as least favorable for the breaking through to mystical modes of consciousness. The rule seems to be that the thought must be silenced, or at least reduced in intensity, and ignored in the meditation. In the records of mystical awakening, it is almost always made evident that preceding the state of illumination, there is at least a brief period of quiescence of conscious activity. Sometimes this appears as though there were a momentary standing still of all nature. For my part, I had previously been aware of a kind of antecedent stillness before each of the critical moments, though it was not translated as stillness of nature. But in the case of the fourth recognition, the foreground was one of intense mental tension and exceptional intellectual activity. It was not now a question of capturing something of extreme subtlety which might be dispersed by a breath of mental or affective activity. It was more a case of facing an overwhelming power which required all of the active phase of the resources of consciousness to face it. The event came after retiring. I became aware of a deepening effect in consciousness that presently acquired or manifested a dominant affective quality. It was a state of utter satisfaction. But here there enters a strange and almost weird feature. Language, considered as standing in a representative relationship to something other than the terms of the language, ceased to have any validity at this level of consciousness. In a sense, the words and that which they mean are interblended in the kind of identity. Abstract ideas cease to be artificial derivatives from a particularized experience, but are transformed into a sort of universal substantiality. The relative theories of knowledge simply do not apply at this level. So satisfaction and the state of satisfaction possess a substantial and largely inexpressible identity. Further, this satisfaction, along with its substantiality, possesses a universal character. It is the value of all possible satisfactions at once, and yet, like a thick substance, interpenetrating everywhere. I know how weird this effort at formulation must sound, but unless I abandon the attempt to interpret, I must constrain language to serve a purpose quite outside normal usage. This state of satisfaction is a kind of integration of all previous values. It is the culminating fulfillment of all desires, and thus renders the desire tension as such impossible. One can desire only when there is, in some sense, a lack, an incompleteness, which needs to be fulfilled, or a sensed goal that remains to be attained. When in every conceivable or felt sense all is attained, desire simply has to drop out. The result is a profound balance in consciousness, a state of thorough repose with no drawing or inclining in any direction. Hence, in the sum total, such a state is passive. Now, while this state is, in one sense, an integration of previous values, it also proved preliminary to a still deeper state. Gradually the satisfaction faded into the background, and by insensible gradation became transformed into a state of indifference. For while satisfaction carries the fullness of active, affective, and connotative value, indifference is really affective, connotative silence. It is the superior terminus of the affective, connotative mode of human consciousness. There is another kind of indifference where this mode of consciousness is bogged down into a kind of death. This is to be found in deeply depressed states of human consciousness. The high indifference, however, is the superior or opposite pole beyond which motivation and feeling in the familiar human sense cannot reach. But most emphatically, it is not a state of reduced life or consciousness. On the contrary, it is both life and consciousness of an order of superiority quite beyond imagination. The concepts of relative consciousness simply cannot bound it. In one sense, it is a terminal state, but at the same time, in another sense, it is initial. Everything can be predicated of it so long as the predication is not privative, for in the privative sense, nothing can be predicated of it. It is at once rest and action, and the same may be said with respect to all other polar qualities. I know of only one concept which would suggest its noetic value as a whole, and this is the concept of equilibrium. Yet even this is a concession to the needs of relative thinking. It is both the culmination and the beginning of all possibilities. In contrast with the preceding recognition, this state is not characterized by an intensive or active feeling of felicity. It could be called blissful only in the sense that there is an absence of all pain in any respect whatsoever. But I felt myself to be on a level of consciousness where there is no need of an active joy. Felicity, together with all other qualities, are part of the blended whole, and by the appropriate focusing of individual attention can be isolated from the rest and thus actively realized if one so desired. But for me there seemed to be no need of such isolation. The consciousness was so utterly whole that it was unnecessary to administer any affective quality to give it a greater richness. I was superior to all affective modes as such, and thus could command and manifest any of them that I might choose. I could bless with beneficent qualities, or impose the negative ones as a curse. Still the state itself was too thoroughly void of the element of desire for me to feel any reason why I should bless or curse. For within that perfection there is no need for any augmentation or diminution. While within this state, I recalled the basis of my previous motivation and realized that if this state had been outlined to me then as an abstract idea, it could not by any possibility have seemed attractive. But while fused with the state, all other states that could formerly have been objects of desire seemed flaccid by comparison. The highest conceivable human aspiration envisages a goal inevitably marred by the defects of immature imagination. Unavoidably to the relative consciousness, the complete balance of the perfect consciousness must seem like a void, and thus the negation of every conceivable possible value. But to be identified with this supernal state implies abandonment of the very base of relative consciousness, and thus is a transcendence of all relative valuation. To reach back to that relative base involves a contraction and blinding of consciousness, an acceptance of an immeasurable lessness. In the months following the recognition, when I had once again resumed the drama in the relative field, I have looked back to that transcendent state as to a consciousness of a most superior and desirable excellence. All other values have become thin and shallow by contrast. Nevertheless, I carry with me always the memory, and more than a memory, of the immediate knowledge of it, and this is something quite different from immediately conveyed, an abstract portrayal of it as a merely possible consciousness. As an intimate part of that supernal consciousness, there is a sense of power and authority, literally of cosmic proportions. By contrast, the marchings of the Caesars and the conquests of science are but the games of children. For these achievements, which seem so portentous and commanding upon the pages of human history, all inhere in a field of consciousness that in its very roots is subject to that higher power and authority. Before mere cataclysms of nature, if they are on sufficiently large a scale, the resources of our mightiest rulers and of our science stand impotent. Yet those very forces of nature rest dependent upon that transcendent and seeming void in order that they may have any existence whatsoever. The mystery before birth and after death lies encompassed within it. All this play of invisible and visible forces seem no more than a dream drama during a moment's sleep in the illimitable vastness of eternity. And so, from out that eternity speaks the voice of the never-sleeping consciousness, and before the commanding authority and irresistible power of that voice, all dreams, though of cosmic proportions, dissolve. Now, as I write, there returns once again an adumbrative presence of that awful majesty. This time, as I am focused upon the problem of objective formulation, I am less blended in the identity and sense it as presence. This mind, which once carved its way through the mysteries of the functions of the complex variable and the Kantian transcendental deduction of the categories, fairly trembles at its daring to apprehend that which threatens momentarily to dissolve the very power of apprehension itself. Fain would the intellect retreat into the pregnant and all-encompassing silence, where the word without form alone is true. This personal being trembles upon the brink of the illimitable abyss of irrelevance that dissolves inevitably the mightiest worlds and suns. But there remains a task to be done, and there may be no disembarking yet. At the time of the culminating recognition, I found myself spreading everywhere, and identical with a kind of space which embraced not merely the visible forms and worlds, but all modes and qualities of consciousness as well. However, all these are not there as disparate and objective existences. They are blended, as it were, in a sort of primordial and culminating totality. It seemed that the various aspects and modes that are revealed to the analysis of relative consciousness could have been projected into differentiated manifestation if I chose so to will it. But all such projection would have left unaffected the perfect balance of that totality, and whether or not the projecting effort was made was completely a matter of indifference. That totality was and is not other than myself, so that the study of things and qualities was resolved into simple self-examination. Yet it would be a mistake to regard the state as purely subjective. The preceding recognition had been definitely a subjective penetration, and during the following month I found myself inwardly polarized in an exceptional degree. In contrast, the final recognition seemed like a movement in consciousness toward objectivity, but not in the sense of a movement towards the relative world field. The final state is at once as much objective as subjective, and also as much a state of action as of rest. But since it is all coexistent on a timeless level, the objectivity is not discrete and differentiated, and consequently is quite unlike the relative world. The godless secular universe vanishes, and in its place there remains none other than the living and all-enveloping presence of divinity itself. So, speaking in the subjective sense, I am all there is. Yet at the same time, objectively considered, there is naught but divinity spreading everywhere. Thus the level of the high indifference may be regarded as the terminal value reached by delving into that which, in the relative world, man calls his I, and yet equally the final culmination of all that appears objective. But this objectivity, in the final sense, is simply pure divinity. So the sublimated object and the sublimated self are one and the same reality, and this may be represented by the judgment, I am the divinity. The self is not of inferior dignity to the divine, nor that divinity subordinate to the self. And it is only through the realization of this equality that it is possible for the individual to retain his integration before that tremendous, all-encompassing presence. In any case, the dissolving force is stupendous, and there is no inclination to resist it. Throughout the whole period of this supreme state of consciousness, I was self-consciously awake in the physical body and quite aware of my environment. The thought activity was not depressed, but on the contrary, alert and acute. I was continuously conscious of my self-identity in two distinct senses. In one sense, I was and am the primordial self, and coterminous with an unlimited and abstract space, while at the same time the subject-object and self-analyzing consciousness was a sort of point presence within that space. An illustration is afforded by thinking of the former as being of the nature of an original light, in itself substantial, spreading throughout, but not derived from any center, while the latter is a point-centered and reflected light, such as that of a searchlight. The searchlight of the self-analyzing consciousness can be directed anywhere within the primordial light, and thus serves to render chosen zones self-conscious. Through the latter process, I was enabled to capture values within the framework of the level of relative consciousness, and thus am enabled to remember not merely a dimly sensed fact of an inchoate transcendence, but as well all that I am now writing, and a vastly more significant conscious integration which defeats all efforts at formulation. The primordial consciousness is timeless, but the self-analyzing action was a process occurring in time. And so that part which I have been enabled to carry with me in the relative state is just so much as I could think into the mind during the interval of penetration. Naturally, I centered my attention on the features which to me as an individual appeared to be of greater significance. It seems to me that this which I've called the primordial consciousness must be identical with von Hartmann's unconscious. For what is the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness if there is no self-consciousness present? Sheer consciousness which is not aware of itself, by reason of that very fact, would not know that it was conscious. Thus an individual who has never known ill health or pain remains largely unconscious of his organism. But with the coming of pain, he is at once aware of that organism in a sense that was not true before. Then later, with the passing of the pain, particularly if it has been a protracted duration, he becomes conscious of well-being in his organism. Well-being has taken on a new conscious value. It is at once suggested that self-consciousness is aroused through resistance in some sense, and interference with the free flow of the stream of consciousness. When this occurs, a distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness is produced that had no meaning before. Now this line of reflection has suggested to me that the real distinction should not be made between consciousness and unconsciousness, but rather between self-consciousness and the absence of self-consciousness. When there is no self-consciousness in a given zone, there is then no more valid basis for predicating sheer unconsciousness than there is for saying that it is a zone of consciousness that is not self-conscious. On the basis of such a view, would not the problem of interpreting how the so-called unconscious enters into consciousness become greatly simplified? The primordial consciousness cannot be described as conceptual, affective, or perceptual. It seems that all these functions are potentially there, but the consciousness as a whole is a blend of all these and something more. It is a deep, substantial, and vital sort of consciousness. The matter, form, and awareness functions of consciousness all at once. It is not a consciousness or knowledge about, and thus is not a field of relationships. The substantiality and the consciousness do not exist as two separable actualities, but rather it would be more nearly correct to say that the consciousness is substance, and the substance is consciousness, and thus that these are two interpenetrating modes of the whole. It is certainly a rich, thick consciousness, and quite other than an absolutely thin series of terms in relation. While in the state, I was particularly impressed with the fact that the logical principle of contradiction simply had no relevancy. It would not be correct to say that this principle was violated, but rather that it had no application. For to isolate any phase of the state was to be immediately aware of the opposite phase as the necessary complementary part of the first. Thus, the attempt of self-conscious thought to isolate anything resulted in the immediate initiation of a sort of flow in the very essence of consciousness itself, so that the nascent isolation was transformed into its opposite as co-partner in a timeless reality. Every attempt I made to capture the state within the categories of relative knowledge was defeated by this flow effect. Yet there was no sense of being in a strange world. I have never known another state of consciousness that seemed so natural, normal, and proper. I seemed to know that this was the nature which reality must possess, and somehow I had always known it. It rather seemed strange that for so many years I had been self-conscious in another form and imagined myself a stranger to this. It seemed to be the real, underlying fact of all consciousness of all creatures. I remembered my former belief in the reality of suffering in the world. It had no more force than the memory of a dream. I saw that in reality there is no suffering anywhere, that there is no creature in need of an aiding hand. The essential consciousness and life of all beings are already in that state, and both never had been and could not be divorced from it. The world field, with all its striving and pain, seemingly lasting through milliards of years, actually is, or seems to be, a dream occurring during a passing wink of sleep. I simply could not feel any need or duty that would call me back to action in the world field. There was no question of departing from or deserting anybody or any duty, for I found myself so identical with all that the last, most infinitesimal element of distance was dissolved. I remembered that it had been said that there were offices of compassion to be performed in the world. But this idea had no reality in the state, because none there was or ever could be who had need for aught, although those who were playing with the dream of life in form might delude themselves with imagining that a need existed. But I knew there was no reality in this dream. The imperative of the moral law no longer existed, for there was not and is not either good or evil. It seemed I could invoke power even in potentially unlimited degree. I could choose action or rest. If I acted, then I could proceed in any direction I might select. Yet, whether I acted or did not act, or whether I acted in one way or another, it all had absolutely the same significance. It was neither right nor wrong to choose anything, or, putting it otherwise, there was neither merit nor demerit in any choice. It was as though any choice whatsoever became immediately divinely ordained and superior to the review of any lesser tribunal. To me individually, the state was supremely attractive, and as the period continued, I seemed to be rising into an irrevocable blending with it. I recalled that if in the self-conscious sense I never returned from this state, there would be some in this world who would miss me and would seem, in their relative consciousness, to suffer. Yet it was only with effort that I could give this thought any effective force. For many years I had known from my studies that reports existed of realizable states of consciousness such that the relative state could be completely and finally abandoned. I had also been impressed with the teaching that it was a wiser course to resist that tendency and hold correlation with the relative form of consciousness. I had been convinced by the reasoning supporting the latter course and had for some time resolved to follow it, if ever the opportunity to choose came to me. This doubtless established a habit form in the personal consciousness, and so far as I can see, that habit alone, or at least mainly, was the decisive factor. For while in the state there simply is no basis for forming any kind of decision, unless that ground is already well established in the individual consciousness out of the life that has gone before. As a result, there was a real conflict between the attraction the state had for me as a center of individual consciousness and the impress of the earlier formed choice. But I, in my inmost nature, was not a part of this conflict, rather standing back, indifferent to the outcome, knowing quite well that any outcome was divinely right. The issue seemed to be a closely drawn one, for as time went on, from the relative standpoint, the organized man appeared to be vanishing, but not in the sense of a disappearance of a visually apparent object. It was more of vanishing as irrelevance may cause an issue or a consideration to disappear. It was as though space were progressively consuming the whole personal and thinking entity in a wholeness comprehension, beside which all particularities are as naught. Personally, I seemed powerless in the process, not because I lacked command of potential power, but simply because there was no reason, no desire, for rendering the potential kinetic. In the end, I fell asleep, to awaken the next morning in full command of my relative faculties, and clearly the issue had been decided. Was it a victory? From certain points of view, yes. Yet, as I recall the profounder state of consciousness, which has continued ever since to seem close to the deeper recesses of my private consciousness, I cannot say that in the ultimate sense there was either victory or defeat. The choice was right, for no choice could possibly be wrong. The full cycle of this final recognition lasted for some hours, with the self-consciousness alert throughout the period. But the depth of the state developed progressively, and at the final stage entered a peculiarly significant phase which strained my self-conscious resources to the utmost. There finally arrived a stage wherein both that which I have called the self and that which had the value of divinity were dissolved in a somewhat still more transcendent. There now remained naught but pure being, which could neither be called the self nor God. No longer was I spreading everywhere throughout the whole of an illimitable and conscious space, nor was there a divine presence all about me, but everywhere only consciousness, with no subjective nor objective element. Here both symbols and concepts fail. But now I know that within and surrounding all, there is a core or matrix within which are rooted all selves and all gods, and that from this lofty peak, veiled in the mists of timeless obscurity and surrounded by thick, impenetrable silence, all worlds and beings, all spaces and all times lie suspended in utter dependence. On that highest peak I could know no more, for the deeps of the deepest darkness and the silence enshrouded in manifold sheaths of silence rolled over me, and self-consciousness was blown out. But ere this I heard, as the faintest shadow of a breath of consciousness, a voice, as it were, from out a still vaster beyond.